So I figured I'd make this video, and hopefully it won't be too long. I really just wanted to talk about what's going on in Ukraine because there's a lot of media and a lot of posturing and a lot of sentiment and emotion and all that going on. But I do think that there's a need for some, backing out and just kind of talking about this from a more rational standpoint. Um, this situation in the Ukraine isn't as simple as it's played out on CNN or on Fox or any other network. Um, in the United States, the political climate here is pretty terrible. Um, there's some uniting on both sides of the aisle, quote unquote, and I hate even acknowledging that there's only two sides because in truth there should be 1,000 sides, but nonetheless, 330 million people, and we have two political parties that are just awful. Um, of course, the Democrats, who are currently in power, are 100% against the Russians. They've made that clear from the time um, that they took power. They were staking claims that Donald Trump was a Russian agent. They've been vehemently against the Russian Federation for quite some time. And against Vladimir Putin. Now, I don't know if that's because of his toxic masculinity or for actual other reasons, but nonetheless, we all know how they feel about the Russians. On the other hand, the neoconservatives, who are the Republican Party, they also have some negative sentiment towards the Russians, just going back through to the Cold War. Even though the Russian Federation isn't a communist state, it certainly has aspects of capitalism. I wouldn't call it capitalists. I wouldn't call it a real democracy. But nonetheless, it is what it is. The Republicans in general, and I'm not talking about Trump. I'm talking about the same old Republicans who've been in power for as many years as their counterparts in the Democratic side. They are not fans of Russia, but they are more concerned with China, as they should be. China is a much more imposing threat and is a openly communist state, um, dominated by political and government philosophy that was taken from Eastern Europe. So, just getting that out of the way, both sides are really against the Russians, and in a sense, both sides are happy to have this conflict, but for different reasons. The Republicans, they're enjoying having a conflict come up during Biden's tenure because they think it's going to help them get elected. And Biden is not happy that there's an incident, but he's happy to have a distraction from COVID, which is going terribly for him. Not from a standpoint of COVID being a major threat to him, but the way that he and other government officials have handled the economy with COVID has unfortunately led to a lousy economy, plus the other fundamental issues of the economy that he has been a part of for 50 years. The overprinting of money and the creation of monetary inflation, etc. His economic policies do nothing to help the economy. Not that Trump's would necessarily fix anything, but his are less aggressive against the economy, but he still meddles too much. Anyway, that's not what this video is about. So, long story short, you have two sides of the aisle, as they say, who are really both uh, vested in this issue in the Ukraine. Now, that really gets me started on my first problem. The United States is very much engaged and very much aware and emotionally and financially and militarily now invested in what's going on in the Ukraine because of essentially, you can call it a border dispute, but the border issue gets more complicated because Belarus, Ukraine, all the countries that align between basically the what would be considered Western Europe, like Germany and Poland, um, all those countries that line up between those countries and Russia have been in question for hundreds and hundreds of years. And if we really want to keep it current, we'll say over the course of the last 160 years. Um, the lines of those countries have changed. They changed dramatically throughout World War I and II. There were battles because of the ethnicity within those countries. You'll have, for instance, in parts of Poland, you had lots of Germans, and then part of Poland was annexed between the Russians and the Germans, and then you have in Ukraine, you have people who are sympathetic to the Russians, people who are not. You have in Belarus is very pro-Russian. It just gets very convoluted. So it's not a simple border dispute, and I won't pretend it is. But in essence, what we're talking about is a border dispute. Now, our country, we don't have a border dispute, but we have a border problem. And our border problem is that we don't monitor our own border. So the American people here are having to see our leaders engage in what could lead to a World War III over a border dispute thousands of miles away in the middle of Europe, while we don't take care of our own border, which directly affects American people here. It affects us because we have fentanyl being brought across our border, which is killing people in this country because it's getting laced into other drugs. We also have drug cartels who are basically empowered to control our border, whether that's because they're paying off people at the border or it's because they're the only ones with the guns at the border. But they are in control of human trafficking as well as drug trafficking. So we have a slave trade occurring. Now, slavery is a hot topic these days because of all the wokeness and all the attempts at the general woke movement and Black Lives Matter. But we have modern slavery in this country, and nobody wants to talk about it. I don't know if it's because it's not black people specifically being enslaved. Some are, I'm sure, but in general, it's a more diverse group of slaves. So for that reason, we don't seem to care as much. We have police departments in the United States who have called for assistance to fight this, and they don't get any response from the federal government because the federal government is all political now. So they don't care about issues if it doesn't fit their political agenda. And one thing that would hurt their political agenda would be an acknowledgement that our border policies have created a lawless border that has led to the rejuvenation of the slave trade. It's beautiful, isn't it? So you have that issue. Why should American people care, want one penny of our tax dollars? We have homeless people in this country, by the way. So we have people here who are homeless, who are starving in our own country. We have a border we don't patrol, but we should spend tax dollars supporting a country that is in the middle of Europe. You're losing me here. Now you could say, well, it's part of a military strategy, economic strategy, geopolitical strategy. Our founding fathers told us not to get involved in foreign entanglements. Stay out of them. They lead to trouble. And what are we doing? We're getting ourselves into one. We have trade with Russia. We have trade with China. Okay? We're very much dependent on oil from all over the world, including OPEC. And the Russians are very much involved in that same alliance. Then you have the EU. The EU makes up nations with which we have a friendly alliance. A country like Germany, for instance. Now, Germany, which is much closer to the Ukraine and Russia than what we are, we have troops there. We have military base there. Big one. We also have missiles. I believe we have missiles in Poland, if that's not correct. I know we have missiles in 2 or 3 different countries in Central Europe. Now, do the Russians have a military base in Mexico? Not that I'm aware of. Do the Russians have a military base in Canada? Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure you can understand where this is going. We have a fear of Putin and his military, and we should have a healthy fear of them. They have nuclear weapons, they're large, they're well trained, and unlike the United States, they haven't been bogged down in a war for the last 20 years. Oh, that's right. We're worried about someone else being the aggressor after we spent 20 years in Iraq, Afghanistan, and then the previous 10 years before that bombing Iraq illegally. Now, NATO, which is supposed to be a defense militia and an alliance, has only been involved in 3 wars with which it's been the aggressor in all 3, in Bosnia and Afghanistan and Libya. So I ask again, why are we getting involved in these things? And if the answer is that no, the Ukraine was not going to join NATO, those were whispers that Putin took too seriously. No, Norway is not going to also join NATO now. And you know what? I hope not. But let's be honest here. In 2014, an elected government in the Ukraine had to deal with a, as we called it in the West, a revolution. But as it was called over there, it was a coup. And this coup was the United States and other European nations putting in a government that would be pro NATO and pro Western alliance versus the Russians. Now, if you're Vladimir Putin sitting in Moscow, a stone's throw away from Ukraine and from the capital there, this might make you nervous. Just as it would make us nervous if suddenly California, when people were going down to Tijuana for a vacation, were met at the border by Russian troops or Chinese troops. That'd be a little uncomfortable, wouldn't it? We wouldn't like that. One of the reasons why that's not happening is because our country, just like our friends to the north and to the south, have the protection of 2 very large oceans. Besides this great land being literally great land, as the U.S. is one of the most fertile and beautiful landscapes in all of the world. It has every kind of climate that you could ask for. You can grow grain, we have a tropical climate, we have a desert climate, we have mountain ranges with snow-capped mountains, we have grass, we have everything, we have every season. It's a very unique country in the sense that you don't have a tropic in Germany. And you don't have snow-capped mountains in Jamaica. But in this country, we have everything. But one thing that this country also has, which has been a huge point of emphasis in defending the United States, is we have 2 oceans on both sides of us. We have the Atlantic and the Pacific. So from a military perspective, and we don't think of this that often, but the United States, if all it did was align its great navy along its 2 oceans and align its great air force along its 2 oceans, the United States would be almost impossible to penetrate by a foreign military force. That's not to say that a terrorist couldn't get into the country, because we've seen that happen. But a foreign military, such as the Russians, such as the Chinese, a militia group, whatever you want to call it, it would be very, very difficult for them to enter into the United States. But we choose to spread our military all across the world. We choose to not patrol our own southern border, which makes no sense from any argument. It doesn't matter. There's no such thing as pro and anti-immigration. That's a bunch of crap. There's literally pro or anti-safety. We should have the best and simplest immigration policies in the world, because we're a free country and a free society, and we have a country where literally people own their property and they should be able to import labor as they want, just like you can buy something on Amazon that comes from another country. Well, if I want to buy labor from another country, I should be able to do that too. But we should have a safe and easy system for people to come in and out of. Instead, we have a system that's long, slow, arduous, so people choose to rely on cartels and to be brought across, fences illegally by criminals. We rely on the black market, or I should say they rely on the black market. Puts nobody in a positive position. Why does our country, which has the ability to defend itself very well, and isn't this an argument about defense? We don't want the Russians to have control of Ukraine because that hurts us, makes us unsafe somehow. Isn't that the argument that we're hearing? Isn't that part of the reason why we have to be involved? I totally disagree with that assessment, but we are not doing our best to protect what we have right here, right now. So it gets very convoluted with regard to why we're interested in one border versus our own. But you have to ask the question, why are we so involved now in the Ukraine? Is it because we did want them to actually join NATO, or we just wanted to threaten the Russians, or maybe we wanted to bait Putin in to this? Maybe we wanted to bait Putin into moving in to the Ukraine. We wanted to get him bogged down in a war the way we were just bogged down in a war to hurt them economically. Because we see the alliance that they have with the Chinese, and we want to somehow cut that off at the pass by getting them bogged in. Now, what we're doing is we're making the Russians more dependent on the Chinese, because now the Russians, who are one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, are going to be selling wheat to the Chinese. That was the Chinese way of basically thanking them for waiting until after the Olympics to invade Ukraine and rewarding them and supplying them with some relief from the economic sanctions that they're facing. Now, the Chinese have said openly, and this is why foreign entanglements are terrible, they've said openly that they will not demagogue the Russians. They will not decree and impose sanctions, and in fact, they have open arms for the Russians. So we've now made China and Russia even closer than they've ever been. That can't be a good thing. We don't have a military alliance with China, but we have open trade with them. And for all the problems that we have with the Chinese, we have a pretty cordial relationship with them. Not that we have a choice. They are the most powerful country in the world right now. And although their military isn't a direct threat to our country here, they do have the ability to march into Taiwan whenever they want. They do have a much more powerful military than what the Japanese have now. And even our forces along the Pacific are not enough to stop them, especially if they were aided by, in any way, the North Koreans, who they are also completely in control of. Another fun fact, China has been recently spreading itself out into Africa, into South America, for growing food purposes and whatnot. And although that doesn't make me so happy, I understand it. But we have to also think, the United States has been in Philippines for years. The United States has been in Japan since World War II. The only country that that suffered a nuclear attack by another civilized nation like the United States. We worry about other countries getting the nuke, but we're the ones who actually used it. So the United States is in Japan, we're in the Philippines, we're in Hawaii, which, I understand we have Hawaii, but Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. If it's part of the United States, I mean, it's really, it shouldn't be. It's part of Asia, but yet we control it. So if you're the Chinese and you're sitting here and you're looking at a map of the world, the Americans are everywhere. Where are you? Yet they're the threat? The Russians are sitting in Russia and they're looking at a map. Are they the threat, or are they under siege and are they being threatened? Now, this isn't to say that we should feel bad for Vladimir Putin or support him. He and his regime are not ones to be in love with, just the same as the Chinese. I'm going to have to do separate videos on the atrocities that they're committing. But this video is about what's going on in the Ukraine and why it has to be discussed from another angle. It's not so simple as good and bad. I also do have an issue and take umbrance with the president of the Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky. He's on social media like this is a television show. And I know he's doing that to try to bait support in by the US. And I have a feeling someone in the CIA is probably telling him to do this. But this social media campaign that he's on, where he's looking like a hero, supporting his troops, fighting for his country, it goes in contrast with some of the ideals that we have. Unless we're in favor of a draft for everybody who's 16 or 18 to 60, they're basically not allowing their own citizens to leave their country. They're not letting the males leave if they are deemed to be able to fight. They have to report to fight. You're forcing them into conflict with a Russian military. That's not fair to them, to force them to put their lives on the line for you. They say it's for the Ukraine, but it's really for Zelensky. They say it's for the Ukraine, but it's really for the United States and the European alliance. You're forcing them to fight for you. And that's the problem with all these wars and these conflicts. It's governments who step out of line, who have no regard for human rights and human life. Ironic, because so many of these people claim to be the liberals or the ones who care, and the neoconservatives who love to talk about life and the right to life when it comes to abortion, but they don't give a damn about life when it comes to military action or the death penalty. So anyway, these people, they want to force them to fight for the Ukraine, but they're really not fighting for the Ukraine. They're fighting for themselves. They're fighting for the government. They're fighting for Zelensky. They're fighting for the geopolitical alliance. They're not fighting for their country. Their country isn't theirs. If their country was theirs, they'd have a right to leave it. They'd have a right to walk out. If my house is on fire, I don't have to sit in the house. I don't have to wait here. I can leave. I have the freedom to leave. How do you own something and you don't have the freedom to interact with it? Are those men and women free in the Ukraine? They're slaves. They're being forced to fight against a trained military. They're slaves. They're not free people. And then we talk about how, we're demagoguing Putin, but every action we've taken against the Russians from an economic standpoint hurts the people there. Apple wants to stop Apple Pay. Google stops Google Pay. All these technocrats, they want to take their stand and we want to look like heroes because they're intimately involved in the politics. They proved that during the election. They've been proving it for years. These people don't care about disseminating information. They don't care about just providing the service that they have. Everybody has to have a political angle now, and it's always the same political angle. It's whatever the fake liberals are supporting. Because these people are not real liberals. They're phony. How is it the liberal thing to do to hurt a civilian, a mother and child in Russia? They're not the ones who are fighting this war. And how many of them came out to support Putin? If you look at all the imagery, people there have been saying that they don't want to have a war with the Ukraine. They don't want to fight for the Ukraine. They don't care about territory and separatist militia groups and fighting the neo-Nazis and all this. They just want to live life. And we're over there hurting the people. We're not hurting Putin. We're hurting the people. But isn't that how it always goes? Innocent civilians in all the countries involved are the ones who are going to be hurt or have already been hurt. While the governments play games. They play economic games, they play geopolitical games, and at the end of the day, nobody's the better for it. I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers. But if I were suddenly given the immaculate power to stop this, what I would do is I would say to Vladimir Putin, I would say, give me the list of areas where you have full support in the Ukraine. And if those areas do not want to be a part of the Ukraine anymore, then allow them to enter into the Russian Federation as a separate state. Something that Lenin would not allow the Ukraine to do, by the way. So the Russians are not innocent in this at all, and I'm not making that point. They're never innocent. But allow them to enter as a separate state. Tell President Zelensky that he can resign for endangering the lives of his own people. I would have an election, which the CIA should not be involved in. Neither should the British intelligence or anyone else, for that matter, the KGB or whatever they're called now. Let's have another election, and let's elect a president, and let's also elect a special action group to move throughout the country and to take in data and have town halls to discuss what the future of the Ukraine should look like. Should it be one unified state? Should it be multiple divided states? Where the alliances are, and go from there. But you have to have peace first to have these conversations. That's what I would do. And I'm not just saying this because I believe personally in the non-aggression pact. I don't start wars, and I believe you treat others how you want to be treated. So if you want to get punched in the face, you should punch somebody in the face. Acknowledge that we had involvement and we were wrong to do so. The United States is never going to admit that. The British, the French, they're never going to admit that. But they can show that, and they can admit and show some contrition by not egging on Zelensky, and by showing a willingness to work with the Russians and to not enforce devastating sanctions against their people. Because if they're trying to starve the people to get them to revolt against the government, that's a foolish move now. The Soviet Union collapsed for many reasons, and many of those reasons are the same reasons we're going to collapse. Just the concept that a civilian in New Mexico isn't valued the way somebody in the Ukraine is valued is ridiculous. Now, you want to talk about insincerity? How about this? Both Nancy Pelosi, in her infinite wisdom, and the President of the United States have stated that they do not believe the United States should increase its own oil production. Because, frankly, we need energy independence from Russia, but we're not going to increase our own oil production. And we're going to make sure we decline all oil pipelines. So, in essence, you want to have independence from a country that you're egging into a world war, but at the same time, you want to rely on them for oil export. Okay. That makes no sense. Why? Because the politics that they've aligned themselves with is against the oil industry, because the oil industry is dominated by the other side of the aisle, quote unquote. So they'd rather starve our own people into higher gas prices at a time when monetary inflation is beginning to affect everything in our society. That makes absolutely no sense. By the way, OPEC has already said they're not changing their arrangement with Russia. So if you were looking for them to join on this bandwagon of anti-Moscow, it's not happening. So now we get ourselves in a situation where it's going to be Saudi Arabia, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, a few countries in South America against the United States, the European Union. That's beautiful. So we have a long ways to go here. I hope that there's peace immediately. I don't want to see anybody else get killed, and I don't want to see other countries continue to get involved because it'll only make things worse. But the narrative that the media is spinning, that one day this guy woke up and decided I'm gonna invade the Ukraine like Hitler invaded Poland, is nonsense. And if you actually study history, you'll know that Hitler didn't just wake up and decide to invade Poland either. That's also bullshit. It was a very, very complicated geopolitical situation between Germany, Russia, the military dictator who was the head of Poland, the British, the French, and the United States. That all led to the start of World War II. It is not as simple. It is not as simple as somebody just woke up and invaded Poland. If you look at the history, you'll see that first of all, Poland was going to be invaded by Russia before Germany, but the Germans did it first. Second of all, you'll see that the French actually invaded Germany before Germany ever fired a shot at France. There's so much more to that than what's being told. But that's a whole nother video and a whole nother subject for a whole nother day. This is all about the Ukraine. And in the Ukraine, I'm hoping that we can have peace and that we can cut the garbage narratives. And the vultures in the media are loving this because it gives them something to talk about other than COVID. COVID was becoming an issue that they were just losing traction on because, unfortunately, this for them, the CDC was conceding things that they were calling people conspiracy theorists or demagoguing them as Trumpers or just being stupid and anti-science. But the CDC is conceding things now that they were demagoguing people for stating and believing in months and even years ago now. So suddenly the COVID topic just isn't as attractive as it was before because they have to keep moonwalking. You think you're watching a Billie Jean music video. They moonwalked miles and miles and miles. So now they got something else to talk about. And they can do the simple, the old school demagogue. It's the thing that they love to do the most. The politicians and the media. They take a subject, they try to dumb it down to pro and anti. And that's all it's about. Because when they can do pro and anti, they can reuse the same language, they can repeat the same narrative, and usually they can demagogue people who disagree with them. In this case, everything is about being anti-Russia and pro-Ukraine. And that's how they simplify it. Does the Ukraine have a neo-Nazi problem? Well, it's subjective whether you consider it a problem, but they do have a presence of Nazis. Did the Ukraine fight on the side of the Nazis in World War II? Yeah, they tried to have an alliance with the Germans because a lot of people in the Ukraine didn't want to be a part of the Soviet Union. That's very true. Do they have Nazis in the Ukraine government? One of the leaders of the neo-Nazi party, which is has the militia that's being referenced a lot in the news that fights for the Ukrainian military that was absorbed into the military officially. The leader and the founder of that, he is part of the government. Yes. So yes, they do have Nazis. Are they in control of the government? No. Are they the majority of the people? No. Are they a risk to the rest of the world? Probably not. Are they committing any genocide or a Holocaust inside of Ukraine? Not that I'm aware of or that we've seen. But are the Russians wrong to say that they are fighting Nazis in the Ukraine and that we're now supporting Nazis in the Ukraine? No, not entirely. But this is why you don't get involved in these sort of things. We'll see what happens. I'll probably do another video about this again and get into some of the other topics that I touched upon. But it's sensitive stuff. I'm sure this might even get censored. I don't care. I'm not going to be muzzled. It's a free country. People died for our freedom of speech. And it's one of the few things that we should hold on to in this country. And I'd like to point out something else. I believe it's the 10th Amendment that basically states that the federal government doesn't have the right to enforce any laws or anything that they don't already have constituted to them in the Constitution. That's the most important part of the whole damn Constitution. Because it protects us from the tyranny of a government like you see right now in the Ukraine, in Russia, in China, in North Korea, and in parts of the United States itself. We all need to be cognizant of this. Our freedom isn't to be given to us. It's ours. We're born to it. And I feel for people in the Ukraine who are waking up and being told that they have to go pick up a gun and they have to go fight for their country when they're really fighting for a president and they're fighting for a political alliance. And I feel for the people of Russia who are now going to be starved economically and sometimes physically because the leaders of their country want to play war games against people who they see as political enemies and geopolitical enemies. And I feel the same way about innocent civilians in China, in North Korea, and in the United States and everywhere else in the world. We have to fight and protect our own freedom, not for our governments, but for ourselves. Because one day we're gonna look back when we don't have it and say, what did we do to protect it? And part of that, in its simplest form, is having an open forum and discussion. And that's the one beautiful thing about the internet. It's easier to disseminate information and to have an open debate. And if you feel like something that I'm saying or something that's being said by somebody else is false, inaccurate, or even purposely manipulative, you can choose not to listen. You can choose to ignore it. But we all have to fight for each other's rights to be able to say it. Because censoring each other and canceling each other is exactly what the powers in different entities of the government and media would want you to do. They want you to be quiet. You have to be able to share information for ourselves to let the people, our elected officials, understand that not only are we watching and we're involved, but that we care enough that people from our own country shouldn't be sacrificed like they were for Iraq and for Afghanistan. This is all part of that fight. Thank you for your time, and I'll be back.